The question of Russia's use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine came up from the beginning of the war. More precisely, after it became clear that Putin had failed to take Kyiv. Russia repeatedly used nuclear threats in various contexts throughout the campaign. As a rule, military failures on the Ukrainian fronts could have pushed Putin to such a decision. Today, the threat of using nuclear weapons remains. However, Western allies consider such a threat unlikely. Moreover, the agenda for a nuclear strike has virtually disappeared, although it was very active a year ago. And in this issue, we will discuss why Russia does not use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, despite such possibilities and many speculations. Russian nuclear threats have been active since the beginning of the war. They are addressed not only to Ukraine, but also to Western countries. Since the first day of the conflict, Russian speakers have been reminding us that Russia has nuclear weapons. Even in Putin's very first address, which essentially declared war, Putin veiledly threatened countries with the use of nuclear weapons if they interfered in Ukraine's affairs. Similar statements have been repeated from time to time by other Russian spokespeople, such as Peskov or Lavrov. Western countries may be avoiding direct involvement in the war for this very reason, to prevent further escalation. At the same time, Russia has also taken actions aimed at nuclear escalation. It has withdrawn from strategic nuclear arms treaties and deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Also, rhetorically and personally, Putin repeatedly repeated the thesis that, in fact, there was already a precedent for the use of nuclear weapons in the world, and the Americans were the first to use them. Such rhetoric alarmed Western politicians, as it literally sounded like a justification for a nuclear strike. As for threats to Ukraine, such threats have also surfaced on several occasions. At one time, the Kremlin raised the topic that Ukraine itself was preparing to attack Russia with a dirty nuclear bomb that the government had allegedly created at its nuclear power plants. Such statements could have been a precursor to a series of provocations, but they did not materialize. Nuclear threats were repeatedly made in response to attacks on Crimea and Russian territory. This has happened many times before, and no nuclear strike has ever taken place. However, at the initial stages, such rhetoric was used, and many people talked about Russian red lines. And of course, the peak of the escalation was Russia's annexation of Ukrainian lands, 4 Ukrainian oblasts that Russia did not and does not fully control. However, the inclusion of these regions in the Russian constitution at the informal level allowed Russia to interpret the presence of Ukrainian troops on its territory as a threat to statehood. Putin personally said so after the annexation. However, this also did not lead to a nuclear strike, although it seemed quite real to many at the time. In recent months, the Kremlin has actually stopped using nuclear rhetoric, although it could return to it at any time. And yet why, despite so many red lines and escalation, has the Kremlin not dared to use nuclear weapons? The first reason is the dubious effect of using such weapons. When it comes to the use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine, Russia will be able to use only tactical weapons against this country, namely relatively small warheads with nuclear charges. They can be used to break the enemy's positions, destroy a concentration of equipment or manpower, or destroy a small city. However, this will not turn the tide of the war, although it will cause significant damage. A nuclear attack, whether single or multiple, can cause serious damage to the enemy, but it is unlikely to dramatically change the balance of power on the front. Russia has the capability to launch similar strikes with conventional weapons, using longer-range missiles. For example, the explosion of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant was a serious catastrophe for Ukraine, comparable to the use of nuclear weapons. Yes, causing damage in this way may have a greater effect and carry fewer risks. Perhaps the only hope is that the Ukrainian government and population will simply be frightened, and after the first strike, even a demonstrative one, Ukraine will make peace with Russia on its terms, simply accepting surrender. However, such an assumption is based only on conjecture, and it is impossible to give an adequate assessment of such a scenario. Therefore, the use of nuclear weapons is an extremely risky option. At the same time, a nuclear attack would have serious consequences. Western countries would be forced to respond, perhaps not with nuclear means, but their significant involvement in the war would obviously not be in Russia's favor. A number of experts have suggested that the United States could launch non-nuclear strikes against key points of Russian logistics and warehouses, both on Ukrainian territory and abroad. Such actions in turn could lead to an open war between Russia and NATO, Russia, despite all its anti-NATO rhetoric, certainly does not expect and fears a direct war with NATO, which could escalate into a nuclear conflict. Moreover, the forces of NATO countries are many times larger than those of Russia, so they would have the advantage. In addition to Western countries, neutral and even friendly to Russia, countries will have to respond. Obviously, setting such a precedent could turn even the closest countries away from Russia, not to mention those that simply remain neutral. The reaction of China and India as major trading partners is likely to be negative. Xi Jinping has repeatedly, even openly opposed the use of nuclear weapons on the territory of Ukraine, so he will not be happy with this state of affairs. India and other nuclear-armed countries may also turn away from Russia. In general, in this case, Russia will be truly cut off from the whole world, not just from Western countries, and will cause irreparable damage to itself. At the same time, as mentioned above, it is unlikely that this will lead to any breakthrough in purely military terms. By the way, public opinion in Russia surprisingly is generally against the use of nuclear weapons. For example, according to a Levada Center poll, 86% of respondents said they did not want nuclear weapons to be used in Ukraine, and only 10% were in favor of such a strike. It is difficult to say how much the Kremlin relies on public opinion today. However, this could, in principle, be one of the factors. In this context, we can also mention the risks of sabotaging the decision by not fulfilling Putin's order to launch a nuclear strike on Ukraine at some point. The likelihood of such an event is impossible to assess, but Soviet and post-Soviet people were raised to believe that nuclear weapons are unacceptable. Failure to comply with the order could be a serious precedent for the Putin regime. In general, the Kremlin can count on a hybrid nuclear threat that arises from time to time. We are talking about the Zaporizhzhia NPP. The explosion of the nuclear power plant or radiation leakage from there is also a serious threat to Ukraine. The damage caused by the plant can be compared to a real nuclear strike on this territory. The Zaporizhzhia agglomeration, with a population of more than 1 million people, is located in the plant's affected area. At the same time, Western countries still do not know how to respond to such a man-made disaster, and they cannot fully equate it with a nuclear strike. In any case, the reaction will be milder than in the case of a nuclear strike. There is a possibility that it will be minimal at all, as was the case with the Kakhovka HPP. Therefore, a hybrid format of nuclear threat is emerging that constantly hangs over Ukraine and poses serious risk to countries in general. Recently, the Kremlin has changed its warfare tactics and now expects to play a war of attrition. If at the beginning of the conflict, Moscow was counting on a quick capture of territory and Kiev's surrender, after unsuccessful attempts to storm both Kiev and cities in eastern Ukraine, Russia has switched to a different tactic, a war of attrition. Such a war implies a protracted conflict on the territory of Ukraine in order to simply exhaust Ukraine in the war and exhaust all Ukrainian mobilization capabilities. At the same time, it would destroy the entire economic potential of Ukraine. Russia has much more resources than Ukraine, so this variant of the conflict will be to its advantage. This tactic does not involve additional escalation, which means that the use of nuclear weapons becomes simply pointless. To summarize, Russia has not yet used nuclear weapons against Ukraine because it does not make sense. The use of tactical nuclear weapons would not change anything significantly on the front line, while bringing additional threats to Russia from all sides and isolating the country from the outside world. In addition, Russia has changed its tactics of warfare. As for the threats, Russia still has the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant, which could become a new point of escalation. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel to not miss new videos.
I never answer to no, man, I still go.